our YouTube station. And then go on to the next slide. So with that, I would like to open up tonight's program and again, welcome you and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Maya McKnight. I'm a public art project manager for the Office of Arts and Culture, and also joined today by two staff members who are behind the scenes making things run effortlessly, Jeremy Bellevue and Ricky Reyes. Next slide. So I also wanted to address and read our commitment to racial equity. The Seattle Office of Arts and Culture commits to an anti-racist work practice that centers the creativity and leadership of people of color, those most impacted by structural racism, to systems that benefit us all. And we also acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land, the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. Next slide, please. This program tonight is part of an overall series. It's the second of three. Today is Thursday, March 9th, 2023. Hope you will enjoy the program tonight and then tune in again in May for the last session that is life after project completion. So post-installation rights and responsibilities. Next slide. This content, as mentioned, is also all recorded and is available website as well as our YouTube channel. So this is just a screenshot from the last boot camp session of that are available for viewing for a slightly different bent and kind of a deep dive into a variety of different topics. And next slide. And so today I'm thrilled to be able to talk about and present hiring subcontractors as part of public art projects, engineers, fabricators, and artwork installers. So we are joined here by our esteemed panel, Marianne Wilson, who's an associate principal at ZFA Structural Engineers, Rob Saccardi, special project manager at Artwork Fine Art Services, that's a Seattle and Portland-based company, and Jeff Hudak, partner at Studio 50. Thank you for being here. I also wanted to introduce our ASL translator this evening, Mary, who is providing translation services for this program tonight. And a request as well is if there's anything that we can better do, if something's not coming clear, please use the chat feature and we'll be able to communicate directly with her regarding any sort of technical issues that might arise with it. With that, I am hoping to turn it over to our esteemed panelists to be able to do a little bit of a self-introduction about what you do and their role within the public art world. And I'll start with Marianne. Marianne, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your role.
Awesome. Thank you, Maya. So my name is Marianne Wilson, principal at ZFA Structural Engineers. I'm a licensed structural engineer and we're located in the Northern California Bay Area. Typically, we do mostly structures, mostly buildings, ranging from residential to commercial, education, winery, really the full gamut. But it's really a treat when we get to work on art projects. It's special to get the engineers outside of their comfort zone, and it's really kind of fun for us to do something that's just completely different. Next slide, please. So we've just got a few images here. Really, our involvement in the public art process is normally one of two directions, that either the sculptor or artist comes to us with a completed design and they want us to anchor it to make sure it's stable so it can't be knocked over. Or sometimes we actually get to help design the structure of the art installation itself. So this was an example of something that the artist brought to us as a finished product. So we did the concrete base and the anchorage. And it was really fun. I actually got to have a little like 12-inch model of this guy on my desk for a couple months. Next slide. Similar with this is actually like a 40-inch diameter foam sphere, mosaic tiled, and primarily our involvement was the anchorage and the concrete foundations. Next slide, please. This install was a little bit more fun. We actually got to design the structure of the art installation. So the artist came to us with a vision, actually a scale model inside the domed roof of what they wanted the rings to look like. So we actually put this into a structural analysis program with each ring supported from the ceiling hanging. So we actually made sure that the rings were stable to support itself. Next slide, please. These little owls are another example of a finished sculpture brought to us that we just helped with the anchorage. Next slide, please. This is an example of a structure that we really got to do some heavy duty structural analysis on, big structural modeling programs. And we actually worked with the artist to make sure that the design was stable. I think initially it was coming off of just a single point. And that was going to be very difficult to keep the sculpture upright. So we worked with them to maintain the artistic intent while making it something that would be able to be supported structurally, but still light. Next slide, please. These little raindrops are another example of a finished sculpture that we just did the concrete anchorage for. Next slide. There we go. Thank you.
Hi, Rob Saccardi with Artwork Fine Art Services here in Seattle. Artwork does a kind of a whole range of art-related services from packing and crating to installation and storage for private and public clients. But I'll just talk about sort of the work we do in the public sector here, installing. What we would do in this case is kind of like the final installation typically. So when a company like Marianne's would specify like how you're going to anchor it down, we would typically execute that plan, including getting the piece to the site, getting it into place, possibly storing it in advance. So that's kind of what we do. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a project, and all of my shots are going to look sort of in the middle of the project. We received these pieces sort of the day of the install. They'd gotten shipped right to us. This is down in Portland. And we basically rigged them into place. It went pretty smoothly. One challenge was that there was a little bit of a miscommunication between some of the mounting for the electrical and the plates. So there was a little bit of a modification on site, and that'll kind of be a theme where usually everything goes pretty much to plan, but a couple things don't, and that's kind of typical with this kind of work. Let's do the next slide. And then this is the pieces getting put in. The electrician working diligently away, trying to get everything wired in place as the kind of the light, the light. We're chasing the daylight here. Next slide. And that's more of a finished shot. Let's go to the next one. This is a project we did in Cal Anderson Park for Horatio Law. This piece is called Lambda, and this was tricky because we had to get two large pieces of glass installed, but they don't support on their own. So we had to have a little bit more work with the engineer to figure out how we were going to have piece A stay in place while piece B get slotted in there. Let's go to the next one. And then you can see after we've gotten the piece in, unfortunately, I don't have a great shot of it in action. And then the next slide, please. And then we've got that kind of armature taken off. Next slide. This is another piece, the same installation. This is sort of a totally different thing. This was made up of glass plates that we got to stack together. So we really got to work by hand. Next slide. And you can see the crew kind of getting in there with, each piece with a suction cup on there so we could keep a good grip on it. Next slide. And then they get stacked up on those rods, which was kind of the finished installation. Next slide. The problem we ran into with this one is that out of those like 100+ glass plates that got shipped over to us from Germany, a couple of them got damaged in transit. So we had to have like new pieces made, and the artist had to be in contact with the fabricator and have new pieces shipped over. We had to swap some pieces out. Next slide. This is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. This is just a mural that we helped reinstall in a school in Yakima. So this is, inside just a big piece that needed a lot of extra hands and a little bit of equipment to get it kind of safely remounted to the wall. Let's go to the next one. And that's the same piece. Next slide. And doing a little touch up. Next slide. This was a nice project. We were out in Bremerton at Olympic College. This is a really large rock that formed the base of this piece. Let's go to the next slide. And the next one, you can see that getting kind of rigged up. and had to be really precisely set into place to get the electrical to work, setting it down. Next slide. And then an armature we built to get the bronze elements installed. And if I have time, there were some interesting like little anecdotes about this one that maybe I can touch on later. Let's go to the next slide. And this is just kind of finishing up the anchoring that in place. And the next one. This is another indoor installation, just showing, you know, a little bit of equipment to get things up into a high place safely. Next slide. And then this was pretty tricky. We did this reinstalled this Thunderbird out in Evergreen College down in Olympia. So we had some access issues getting that large piece of equipment to the site. We were really close to capacity for a bridge we had to cross on site. And then let's go to the next slide. There was no overhead room for this, so we're really like right up against the underhang on that roof there and rigging right off the end of those forklift blades, which was pretty tricky to get this piece installed. Next slide. That's the finished piece. Let's do the next one. And then this is a large mural on metal panels we installed down in Tacoma. There were some, the install went really smoothly, but the challenges on that one were just site access. And that's something we can talk about later as well. A lot of stakeholders on that project all have very different requirements for what you had to do to get on site and to work on their job site. And that's something that we deal with quite a bit. Next slide. And then this is us working again inside. You know, the tricky part of this is just getting onto that wall. We're in a big, huge stairwell, installing a really large, really interesting wood three-dimensional piece. Next slide. And you can see just sort of working from that scaffold in that space. Let's do the next one. And the next one. And the next one. Yeah, so that's kind of a range of the different projects we do. Next, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Jeff, if I'd like to invite you, and we also had a request from the audience to be able to mention the artist of the artwork, if you know, in your examples. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Maya. So my name is Jeff Hudak. I'm a co-founder and partner at Studio 5050, which is a custom fabricator in Seattle. We offer a full range of art services from design through installation. We fabricate artwork that's really of all scales. We can go next slide, please. And that's located in public settings such as airports, parks, museums, institutional buildings, and we've got a number of pieces that we've done in private collections as well. Our studio specializes in artwork that really leverages 3D modeling and digital fabrication. You can see kind of like in this first project here, the Wanderer downtown Seattle, it's by Sutton Bears Color, where just every single piece is a unique one-off component. Usually in projects like this, you know, we'll have upward of 1,000 unique individual single pieces. And so we really leverage 3D modeling and digital fabrication to do these types of projects just due to the sheer number of unique parts that are involved in them. Next slide. This approach allows us to include useful information such as like part labels and fabrication alignment guides and things of that sort that are just etched directly onto the parts as we're fabricating them. And that way, as we go into assembly and even installation, we've got these kind of pre-built guides that we've brought from that digital model into the physical components. It also additionally allows us to evaluate the artwork geometry by using that 3D model so heavily, so that when we are doing things like figure out exactly how we're going to lift or turn or pick a component, we'll look at where the center of gravity is in the 3D model, and maybe during the design phase, we'll go ahead and integrate a couple of pick points that will allow us to orient it properly. Just as it's lifted right off the vehicle, it can just go get dropped right into place. So things like that we really try to approach projects holistically, so that any of those downstream issues things that Rob's talking about, coordination issues, some of those things we try to head off on the front end if possible. Not always possible though. As a studio, we offer a variety of services to various artists. In some cases, we're just providing like an engineered armature, like for instance, in the project we're seeing in the background. Can you go back one slide, please? Cascadia, which is at SeaTac Airport. In this case, we provided the design services, we fabricated the armature that's actually supporting these giant glass panels that's completely wrapping around an escalator bay. So kind of both a tricky installation as well as just a very public place to put something in place. And so that in that case, we were kind of just providing the armature, the engineered armature, the cladding, and then the install was done by the Port of Seattle in this case. Other cases, we're actually providing full service from concept development all the way through installation. We primarily do all of our modeling in Rhino 3D, as well as a parametric plugin called Grasshopper. Kind of all funny names, but they allow us to kind of work to apply a lot of those labels and other elements into our modeling without individually modeling each piece. It's kind of like writing a recipe for the artwork or the sculpture, if you will, that allows us to kind of create each individual component. In other cases, we'll have an artist come to us with a fully developed, design, engineering drawings, and then they're just looking for us to provide our shop drawings to the engineer, fabricating and installing. However, in the majority of projects, we are kind of taking on, we get approached with like a sketch or a little physical model, for instance, and a rough sense of scale, and that's kind of our jumping off point for a lot of the projects. And then we get to kind of guide them through design, development, shop drawings, fabrication, and installation as well. Next slide. So for instance, this was a really parametric or a really 3D model heavy project that we did at Hinghey Park in the International District here in Seattle. It's a 70-foot wide gateway that's 22 feet tall and spans the entire corner of the block. Go back one slide, please. And so these individual space frames that we worked with very closely with our engineering team to develop became the kind of the armature for the cladding to then hang off of. And that was just a really fun, interesting project. Probably our largest kind of like space frame type geometry project that we've done. It was just a really exciting thing to do. Next slide, please. Also in that park are the cultural steps. There are 5 of these steps that blend into the serpentine paths that wind its way down through the new expanded part of the park. And this is where we talk about those all unique one-off parts. I think there's something like 2,500 individual parts that are all different in these assemblies. There's no 2 that are the same. So it gets really important, and you can see, back one slide, please, that top left-hand corner there, we've got diagrams that lay out every single individual part and where it goes within those structures, so that when we're welding them up together, all we're doing is looking at our kind of our instructions and our kit of parts that we've laser cut or water jet cut, depending on what the project is. And that's how we end up bringing these really unique one-off pieces back together. Next slide. And speaking of armatures, then this project, the Wawona, which is in the Museum of History and Industry, MOHI, here in Seattle, was a piece we did almost 10 years ago now, I think, for John Grotti. And so in this case, we were, again, designing and fabricating the armature. Next slide. Is there another slide, or back one maybe? There we go. That the artist then shaped and carved all these panels. So we provided the steel armature that all the cladding attached to, and then machined 5 of the 6 sides of the components, gave those to the artist, and they did all of this beautiful shaping and kind of fluting that is on the exterior of it. Is there a next slide, or is that it? I think that's it. So yeah, that's kind of in a bridge version of what we do.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So a question for all of you, and Jeff, I'll actually start with you. You answered a little bit of this is part of your introduction, but when you're thinking about a public art project, kind of from beginning to end, from, you know, the initial kernel idea to in the ground finished piece, like, how do you see your role of it, like specifically as a, what touch point? And thinking about like an artist who this might be a first or a second public art project, when is the ideal time to engage in starting a conversation with a fabricator?
As early as possible. It's really important. I think, and this is basically how we approach all of our projects, is kind of in a very holistic manner. We try to have, you know, at our very early kickoff meetings, engineer, fabrication, installation, any other parties that might be involved in a project. That might be, for instance, crane operators or a crane lifting company if we have a really weird or funky lift that we're going to have to be doing, and wanting to be aware of kind of what our constraints are as we're even working in the design phase. And I talked a little bit about even integrating like pick points for the artwork to be able to be lifted into position during the early design phases. And so overall, we kind of have this, we typically try to act as a project manager for the projects. We have a lot of experience in kind of all these different little pockets of the process. And so typically we try to act as that like touch point for all of the folks involved in the projects. Probably in a larger context, though, our services kind of span the scope of the art project. However, we're typically the small part of a much larger construction project in a lot of these public art projects. And so in those instances, we really need to be able to coordinate with a really broad range of parties, including like the base building engineer, architect, general contractors, specialty contractors, as well as the owners, developers, and community groups. And so our kind of backgrounds in architecture, fabrication, construction, and rigging are all kind of good places to start those conversations, and gives us a lot of background to be able to come back to the artist and kind of help to explain some of those pieces of information.
Wonderful. Great. And Marianne, same question for you. Like, what's the ideal time for an artist to be able to reach out to an engineer for engineered drawings?
I think it's going to depend on what they're actually looking for from us. Like in a nutshell, what we do for the artist is provide the design and documentation to help them achieve a building permit for installation. So if they're just looking for us to provide the anchorage for a finished piece of artwork, we actually come in relatively late in their creative process. We get the connection point, and then we just work with the attachment, fastenings, and the concrete foundations. If it's something that's a little more elaborate, that Jeff was talking about, where they make the armature and you actually need the engineering for the sculpture itself, then it's really great if we can come on earlier in the design process before things are maybe fully set in stone, so we can give some advice or, you know, some back and forth about, okay, if we do this, it'll, you know, lighten it up, but if we try to go this direction, it's going to be a lot heavier. Try to optimize some of the structure so we can actually get the design vision for the artists.
Wonderful. And Rob, same question. Is there a best time where artists can engage with an installer?
Yeah, I mean, usually we get asked to do a cost estimate relatively early in a project, or at least once it's gotten to the point of maybe engineering is done and you're trying to get a sense of how the piece is actually going to finally physically get installed. But we're happy to get involved earlier than that, which can lead to some good conversations about like, how is this going to be put in place? Is it a tricky location? So kind of, I think everybody sort of alluded to this, but like working backwards sometimes from if this is going to be hard to put in place, or there changes you want to make to it by talking to people, that can be really important. And then, yeah, once we get the initial, and then kind of the point at which we get involved, the more information we have, the more accurate of an estimate we can get, and that's probably true for any kind of subcontractor you work with. So there's sort of a balance between that too. You know, you can get a really inaccurate estimate because you have incorrect assumptions early on in the project that maybe if you had waited, so you may have a scope that is going to have to change because you didn't really have everything in line before you kind of started to get some quotes. So that's maybe a challenge there.
Great. Great. So Rob, you mentioned that like as much information as possible to be able to provide the most accurate quote. Can you talk about some of the information that you need? Like if an artist were to come to you, like what are kind of the top 5, top 10 elements of information that you really need to be able to kind of start working with an individual and provide accurate quote?
Yeah, I mean, from my end, it's really basic technical information like the size, the weight of the piece, where it's going, what the access is going to be like at that location. Those are those are kind of the really simple, direct technical things. What methods, what the engineers called out for how we're going to be installing the piece. And then beyond that, like constraints on the site can have a big impact on kind of like questions in budgeting, like is the work going to take place during regular hours, or are there constraints where the work has to take place at night or on a weekend or something specific like that? I mean, as you can imagine, the cost is really different for night work than it is for weekend than for day work. And then is it a prevailing wage project for the installation, which is a big question that impacts kind of the budget or our estimate as well. Those are kind of maybe the first 5 or 10 questions I'd like to get when I started working on an estimate for a project.
That's great. And Marianne, same question. Like when you start working with an artist, what kind of information do you absolutely need to know?
I mean, so for us, we get started with where is it located? Is it a ground mount? Is it elevated? Is it hanging from the ceiling? And that'll give us a little more information about how we're going to be anchoring it, and then sort of what's pre-existing in the site. Is it a fully new like landscape project where there's really no obstacles for the new foundations, or is it, say, an existing hardscape that we're cutting into where there may or may not be existing foundations, existing utilities underground? The more information we have from the get-go, the easier that's going to be to get something that's more closely resembles the final product. If we're hanging from a structure, are there any existing drawings for the original building so we know what we're attaching to? We need the usual information about the piece of artwork, the dimensions, the weight, sort of how it's planning on attaching. Is it pretty much vertical, upright, so it could mostly support itself and we just need to hold it down so it doesn't tip over? Or is it, leaning? Is it expecting a lot more out of the foundation or attachment points? So we have to design these not only for their sort of their standing condition, their normal condition, but also we try to look at it, is this something people can climb on? Do we need to anticipate, a person load hanging off of one end, or what happens in the event of an earthquake to make sure it doesn't fall over?
Wonderful, thank you. And Jeff, same question for kind of like intake. And I know it probably varies, but like if someone were to walk in with a doodle on a napkin, would that be enough?
Yeah, it is, which is kind of interesting. Now, I think, like Rob was mentioning, in a lot of cases, what you're being brought really drives how accurate of a estimate or quote you might be able to provide. In a lot of cases, when we're working with an artist, we start out with working with a rough order of magnitude estimate. We aren't going to go and price every individual piece when we're looking at a sketch. We don't necessarily even know what the engineering is going to look like at that time. Is it 1/4 inch steel, or is it 3-inch thick plate for some reason? It can really vary. So what we do is we just kind of take our background and experience and kind of put together an estimate, rough order of magnitude, to understand like what we're really looking at cost wise. Some of the initial things that we look at asking our clients, and I'll probably be echoing some of these from both Rob and Marianne as well, but the really starting out, what stage are you in? Where are you at in your process? Have you already started working with an engineer? Do you have 2D drawings or a 3D model, or would you be able to provide those in the future? Or is it really we're starting from a sketch, which is totally and absolutely fine? It just takes a little more development on our side. We're able to then estimate that as part of our costs. What materials do you anticipate it being fabricated from? Are there any material requirements from your client? Overall for us, as we're trying to put together this kind of broad design through installation estimate, we look at what's the anticipated budget, what does the scope of work include, is that design, development, engineering drawing, permits, fabrication, foundations, installation. Any of those pieces of information they might happen to know or can speak with either their client or their project manager to figure out is really helpful for us. in putting together those costs.
Wonderful. Great. So Jeff, I'm going to keep you in the hot seat for a minute. So you're working from an artist, you work through all the details from kind of doodle to an agreement, and you're about to enter into a contract with an artist. Can you speak a little bit about like some of the elements of your contract, contingencies, if costs change midway through, any sort of items that are specific to your field of work, and anything maybe that has surprised artists that is a part of the overall contract?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we really like to get the project, we'll work with a rough order of magnitude before we're, going and actually signing a quote or a quote and an agreement for fabrication or design through installation. And generally speaking, we try to always maintain within that unless there's something that's really outside of our control. So kind of the key items in our agreements are typically the scope of work, in that we outline the entire scope of work, every aspect of what we will be doing, what we'll be providing as part of the fabrication, or design stages or installation stages. A list of assumptions for fabrication and installation that we've based all of our scope of work on, and our pricing on. We'll have a payments section that discusses schedule and terms. One thing that can sometimes be surprising for new artists who haven't necessarily done a project of this sort before is sales tax. Something we kind of always have to remember, that especially in our region, it's a big chunk of a project's cost, and being aware of that kind of going into them, and being aware that that'll be a portion of the project cost. And then schedule, and that's usually not fixed for fabrication specifically until we actually have like a commencement payment that's been received. And that way we can start to set a schedule based on that, and make sure that we're kind of integrating that with all the other parties that may be involved in those projects. Just a couple other quick items. The things that also maybe sometimes are a little bit surprising are things like maybe a storage fee. In a lot of cases, we try to work with artists, as be as flexible as we can. That, say for instance, needs like stay an extra couple of days, probably not a big deal. But if it's a part of one of those larger projects, like we talked about earlier, for like a building that's being built, and that building went on hold, for construction for a year, we can't just have a giant piece of artwork hanging out in our shop for another year until the building gets completed. That's a liability for us, because we're insuring the artwork while we have it in our possession. And so we usually have to work with the artist or or maybe their client to either take on the storage, or we may have to charge a storage fee to help offset some of those costs.
Great, thank you for that. Rob, same question for installing, contracting processes, and anything that might surprise someone who's entering into a contract for the first time.
Yeah, Jeff gave a really succinct answer, and that covered a lot of what I was going to say. I think being the last sort of stop on the train, I'll talk about delays. Delays happen a lot. To get the install done, every single thing has to kind of line up, whether that's the fabrication being done, every bit of like hardscaping being finished, every condition on site being ready to go. So we run into that a lot, where, we've got X date and you're looking to do this in the summer, and it gets pushed and it gets pushed and it gets pushed. That can do a couple things. That can change, you're going to get an estimate, and if you're doing work a year later, we may have different rates. The estimate is probably not going to be valid for that long. The storage fees are a big thing. Last second changes can be a cost too, and that should all be in any estimate you get. Like if you go to show up on the day of and something external to your out of your control cancels work that day, and I've got a crane crew on site and my crew is there to work and we can't work, you're going to expect there's going to be a cost associated with that. So there's just a lot of ability for cost overruns to happen, and that's something people should be aware of and maybe budget for, or include a contingency or ask for a contingency to be budgeted in to their project. That might be a useful thing. Read your contracts very carefully. That's good advice for anybody signing any contract, but actually read all the fine print. That's usually a good idea in life. Yeah.
Great. And Marianne, anything additional to add to that question?
I think the primary thing that we do is really try to outline that scope of work, what's included, what's not, what would be considered extra later, or at what point changes would be considered an extra. For us, it's critical. Do we know if we're designing components of the actual structure, or is it really just anchorage? If it's something that's going to want to be a little bit more collaborative, we'll usually lean on an hourly type fee. So it gives us the flexibility to, try different things, and we may be able to give an estimate if we can kind of see where the scope is heading. If it's something simpler, like just an anchorage of an existing sculpture, that the scope is very much more set, then usually we can do a fixed fee for that. We do typically break out the construction component. We'll provide services as needed during the construction process on an hourly basis. The one thing that's not really part of our contract, but does tend to surprise artists, is that depending on the nature of your install, that either if it's foundations or attachments to existing structures, is the requirements of the building code for special inspections. That if you didn't cast your anchors in place, if you have to do a post-installed anchor in concrete, those require special inspections. If you're connecting to an existing structure and you need to do structural welding for your attachment points, that requires a special inspection. And usually those are additional fees by an outside entity.
And Marianne, maybe to speak to that a little bit as well, because we have come across special inspections quite often, of course, is that in our agreements, a lot of times, because that special inspection ends up being kind of reassuring for the building owner, the client, whoever the end owner of the artwork is. In our agreements, typically what we try to do is align that as that we will coordinate, but the fees and things like that for that aspect of it fall onto the shoulders of the owner of the artwork in the end. Is a way we've kind of worked it in the past, and it's been pretty good. So.
Yeah, and sometimes it's really included in sort of our boilerplate language and in our drawings that it's one of the components that's required by the building code, and we have a list of the required special inspections depending on the materials that we're utilizing. But oftentimes it's a surprise that they go to construction and the building officials out there saying, well, you need your special inspection, and it wasn't something that they thought to coordinate ahead of time. If we don't, say, have another fabricator or a different installer working with the artist if they're trying to do it themselves.
Yeah.
Great point. I was hoping, and I'll start with Marianne, if you could think of and share an example of a past project that you've worked on that can highlight or emphasize some aspect of learning that you'd like to share with artists entering the field of public art, or provide some insight into your process. So I'd love to hear a real world example.
So one project we did, unfortunately, we didn't have a photo of it. We did a public art project. It's a 50-foot tall obelisk on a 10-foot tall concrete base, and it's a steel truss tower, and it's covered in used bike parts. So it's an obelisk. They called it the cyclisk. And it was really neat trying to put that together, because we actually got to design a steel trussed tower that the artist fabricated themselves and then applied all of the bike parts to. And so they hauled it out on site on a flatbed and then craned it into place. So you've got this 10-foot tall concrete tower, and you've got all your nice little anchor bolts placed in the concrete. And it's, the install, there's always something. And apparently some of the bolts weren't perfectly vertical or installed in quite the right location. So you turn around and they're just banging on the bolts, trying to get them to fit in the base plates. I mean, there's always going to be something for install. And another one, the rings, the hanging from the ceiling, that we were working with the artist, and they brought in a full scale model that we had of little wire rings that we actually got to put into our analysis program. So actually working with them, going, okay, we need something over here. The whole thing is trying to sag this direction. What would not be offensive or intrusive to include here? Can we get another attachment point up to the structure? I think that's really fun, that the collaboration, being able to work through the design of the actual artwork structure.
That's great. Thanks so much. I think your statement of the unexpected does always happen for installation is very true. And I bet, Rob, you might have a story or two regarding that.
Yeah, let me think of a good one on that theme. The unexpected. What's a good one for that? Um, yeah, let's actually, can we go back to my slide deck? Can we do that? To sort of the one with a large rock. I want to talk about I like that rock. Yeah, keep going. Keep going. Yes, this one. Okay. Yeah, this was a cool project. I really enjoyed this process. So the unexpected on this was sort of, well, let me start from the beginning on this one, I guess. What I wanted to talk about was there are two big components of this piece, this large rock and then these bronze elements, the sculptural elements that come out of it. And in working with the artist, I know they spend a ton of time doing concept drawings and working out all the details on these bronze elements, and then like probably making a mock-up and then a CAD drawing and having them fabricated and finished perfectly and all that stuff. I'm sure that was 95% of the work, and they spent about 5% of the time picking out this lovely rock from a quarry and getting a couple holes drilled in it. And then for my end of it on the install, I spent about 95% of the time and the budget on the rock and 5% on the bronze part. They gave me this 7,000-pound rock, which means it needs heavy equipment for every single time you touch it. I had to flatbed it out to site. We needed a pretty big crane to get it in place. And on top of that, the base was really specific for this, and this is probably a real engineering thing, but the first pour of the base was completely wrong, and then it had to be completely ripped out and done again. So then you get into like, oh, we had a date, the base is curing, oh, it's completely wrong, your project is delayed, there's a big cost overrun. I have to sort of stand down all my contractors and all this stuff. And all this is because of an element that was probably, again, like 5% of the consideration on the project that becomes like the really difficult technical aspect of it from an installation kind of point of view. So after all those delays and everything, if we could go forward a couple of slides. It took us, days and kind of weeks of planning to get the rock in place, and then about 4 hours to get the bronze installed, once that was all said and done. So yeah, that's a good example, I guess.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Jeff, I'd love to invite you to.
I think it's becoming a theme of foundations to some degree here. Could we go over my first image of my deck, please? So this was the Sutton Bears Color project titled The Wanderer. It's out in front of the Google building right downtown in Seattle here in South Lake Union. And the formwork and the foundations were put in by this is again one of those splits where the building contractor ended up doing the foundations because they're actually over a parking deck that's below grade. And this is also a large bioretention planter, the whole length of it as well. So we were dealing with waterproofing. We were dealing with how much volume our footings were taking up and removing that amount of water that could actually be retained within each of the vaults going along the surface there. Just a lot of moving parts going on to get those in there. And we created a set of templates for all the anchor bolts. We got out there, did our special inspections for all the re-steel and the anchor bolt locations. The concrete gets poured, we haul all this artwork out to site to start assembling it, and we realized the first footing had tilted significantly to one side, and we're like, what's going on here? Like, wow, the weather was coming in, we had to hurry and cast it, we just had to get it done, and it is what it is. So instead of the first day us going out and setting all the parts, all of the big pieces off the foundations, the first day turned into 100 and some foot long line, good old masonry line, trying to figure out, can we actually still hit the center line of all of our foundations without some weird kink showing up along the way. Luckily we had enough extra space in our base plates because we were welding plate washers on top on site and then bolting down. So that gave us a little bit of extra wiggle room. But the biggest thing I can say is anytime you can give another contractor templates, give them templates. It will simplify your life for lots of reasons along the way. And sometimes there are just those things you can't fix, and you try to adapt and overcome on site. So
that's great. Thank you so much for that. That is what I have for my questions. I invite all the audience to be able to use the chat feature to enter questions as well. We have about 15 minutes or so left, and we do have a couple of questions in the chat already. One of the questions is, how many projects do each of your companies create, install per year? Do you often turn artists away? And I think on top, kind of in response to that as well, like if someone is seeking to work with a company, how do they go about finding and checking references and looking to see if they want to work with a different company? Marianne, I'll start with you.
Goodness. Okay. I mean, we usually do at least several projects a year. It really varies depending on demand. It's definitely not our primary focus, but we do think it's important to get that variety of projects in. So we usually always welcome it, unless we're completely swamped. We don't typically turn away artists. As far as trying to figure out if we're someone you would want to work with or vetting another engineer, typically as part of the proposal process, learning more about the art piece, I'll end up on the phone for an hour or two with the artist, just kind of talking through what they're planning, any concerns they may have. And that would be my advice if you're looking to hire an engineer. I mean, their engineering background is important as well, but is this someone that you actively want to be in a collaborative process with, that you're going to be able to communicate with? I think that's important.
And Rob.
Yeah, similarly, we work with art all the time. A lot of what we do is for the private sector, so I can't kind of reference that or sort of show images of it. So these public projects, we do, oh, I'd have to count them up. It's definitely probably not one per month, but we're in something like this, approaching that, depending on what the demand is in any given year where we're out doing this kind of work. And yeah, you could expect anybody you're interested in hiring to be able to provide references. You should be able to get a pretty good feel for if they've done similar projects. I mean, everything like this is unique, but you want to hire somebody who has at least projects that are similar, so they have a kind of a broad sort of vocabulary to pull from, and like a large sort of pool of experience to say, I did something similar and this worked, or this I'm foreseeing might be an issue with what you're doing, and that's where experience is really important. And then having somebody who you feel like you can communicate well with, who can kind of talk to you about that kind of thing as you're working on your project.
Great. And Jeff, anything to mention or add?
I think I'm probably echoing a lot of those items. Have that conversation. A lot of times we start out with, a half hour or an hour long phone call maybe, or a meeting at our shop if it's someone local, to just kind of go over, what they're thinking, what they're trying to accomplish, and how we can, be of assistance for that. As far as deciding who to work with, obviously I think you can get a lot of good feedback just having that initial discussion with them. But as you start to get things like a rough order magnitude estimate, you start to read through that information. Don't let it just be, line one, we'll build it for you for this much. That's the end of it should be really spelled out step by step as far as what all is going to be a part of their scope of work. And I think just understanding that, having a good feel with who the individual is, and of course, Rob said, being able to get some, references or see other work that you've completed in the past is just really important.
Wonderful. Thank you. Another question is kind of talking about liability and insurance. So in general, does the installer, fabricator, engineer carry that insurance, and kind of potentially, and how far in the future is the coverage, or does it shift to the site owner? So like in terms of your work and your scope of work, what is that liability insurance that you do agree to as part of your overall contract agreement with the artist? Rob, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I may have the shortest sort of scope, because I don't think we've ever attempted to carry any insurance for when we're not actively involved with the piece, which is sort of the end step. So we carry insurance with a certain value for projects. We can raise that for projects as well. So if you know that you have a particular requirement, be upfront about that. It's easy to scale that up as we need to with our insurance company. I'm sure most places can do that as well. You obviously want to make sure that whoever you're hiring has the insurance required by wherever they're working. So wherever they're working may have different requirements. I don't think I can speak to like who carries the insurance after the piece is installed. I'd imagine that's the owner of the piece at that point, but we can certainly insure it while it's in our care. If I'm transporting it or storing it when there's a delay, that's something that my company, is expecting, can take care of or is expecting to take care of.
And Marianne, any comments on insurance or liability in regards to engineering?
Pretty much echoing what Rob said, we carry it usually with the artist, with the client that we have our contract with, usually commensurate amount to how much our involvement is, the scale of our fee, and then we are able to provide a sort of a sample liability insurance during the proposal process if that's required.
Great. And Jeff, anything to add?
Not a whole lot. It's pretty general as far as our scope goes, between some professional liability, general liability, things like transportation, being able to insure things while they're in transit, even if we aren't the ones actually transporting them specifically. All those things are kind of rolled into our general insurance package for our clients.
Great. Great. So the next question I have is a little bit about money. The question is are there reasonable percentage to set aside for contingency? And I think I'd like to expand on that a little bit as well. I know like there's so many variables in the different projects, but kind of in terms of like general expectations, any sort of rule of thumb within your area of expertise that you are able to advise artists in terms of they received in a public art project, they received a commission for this amount, how much would they expect for a certain type of artwork, or any sort of insight you have kind of into that world. And Jeff, I'll start with you.
Sure. With regards specifically to contingencies, a lot of times depending on who's commissioning the artwork, they may actually have a requirement. And that's one of those big things that kind of circles back to our agreement discussion earlier in contract discussion, is make sure that you go through all of the information from your commissioning agency if it's commissioned through an agency. A lot of times they have other requirements that might not be necessarily the norm in the regular kind of construction and fabrication industry. So being aware of those, I think, is really important. And in a lot of cases, their contingency will be associated with that. Outside of that, it's largely, as far as like a percentage goes, it scales, I think. So if it's a $5,000 art piece versus a $300,000 art piece, we wouldn't just say like 10% either way, because that's a very different number between those two. And so it really is kind of variable. And I think during those initial discussions, we're developing a rough order magnitude estimate is when we can help provide some guidance on those.
Great. And Marianne, any comments on that?
We aren't typically involved too much in the contingencies during the construction project. Really, the only extras we would have is if the project changes after a significant amount of work has been done, or if the scope continues to increase or modify.
And Rob, any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, the less defined information you have, the more I'd be inclined to make the contingency larger. The more you can narrow down what you're doing, the more you'll have an idea of what it's going to cost to do. I try and when I know something, when I think something might come up, I'll try and line that out, and if needed, sort of in place of a specific contingency. So I can say if you hit delays, this is what it's going to cost to store this per month. There's things like that we can kind of easily account for. But it kind of all depends on the project. Like some things you can tell are going to be more complicated and more prone to things getting out of whack, and that doesn't necessarily have to do with the total scale, because you could be doing something that's relatively straightforward a lot of times, which could make something more expensive than one individual installation that could be complicated and more prone to going over budget. So I think it really is a case-by-case basis.
Great. And another question here, somewhat related to money, is how small is too small of a project for each of you to consider? Do you have minimums for projects that you're willing to work for? And Rob, if you want to start with that.
Yeah, no, we don't have any minimums for things like this. Yeah, not particularly. We do, a very wide range of scales of work. So, from installing one piece to multi-day, multi-week kind of complicated installation. So, yeah.
And Jeff and Marianne, anything to add? Is it
I think from our side of things, it just needs to kind of make sure that it's commensurate with the scope of work versus the value of the project. And if we can do things like, for instance, build just an armature and let the artist do like all the cladding work, things like that, where we can work together to let them have more hands-on in the process, to help keep costs down a little bit more and put some of those costs back on the artist to be able to kind of do parts of the project. Sometimes we'll do it that way to help with those budgets.
wonderful? Great.
We'll
And
do
so,
sort of all sizes of the projects, really with little 20-inch sculpture to get anchored to the ground, or our 60-foot obelisk. If you're going for a building permit and we need to do drawings or calculations, a building department package, there is a certain point at which it's not any less work just because it's smaller. So sometimes there will be a bottom end to the fee, but there's really no limit to how small the project can be.
thank you. And the last question for this evening, words, one sentence, what would your advice be or knowledge to impart to the next generation of public artists? And Jeff, I'll start with you.
Oh, sure. Well, as far as we're concerned in the design and fabrication field, we love a challenge. The uniqueness of every project we're involved in is what really keeps us looking for new ways to design and build things. So as an artist, keep pushing the envelope. We can't wait to see what you come up with next and try to figure out how to build it.
Great. And Marianne, do you have a
Very similar to Jeff. It's that as an engineer, it's like our definition of creativity might be slightly different than the artist, sort of where we can be creative, but it's important to have a team that you can communicate with and that's willing to challenge each other to push the envelope so you can, see really what's possible to make the vision, the design vision come to life.
And Rob?
Yeah, for me, so much of what we see is in sort of like private and behind closed doors. So getting to do things in public is really important for me. And so just kind of keep it up with the public art.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for imparting your wisdom and sharing your experiences and expertise. Thank you, Mary, for being here to provide ASL translation. And thank you to everybody who took time out of their Thursday evening to join us here tonight to learn more about public art and working with subcontractors, fabricators, engineers, and installers. Really appreciate everybody, and we look forward to joining next time in May, where we talk about our next boot camp topic, the life of artwork after installation. So thank you again, and we'll see you in May. Thank you. And